When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Joseph Stalin faced annihilation. The Wehrmacht was at the gates of Moscow. Leningrad was under siege. Millions of Soviet soldiers had already been killed or captured. Stalin needed allies, but he did not trust them. In Stalin's eyes, the American military was an unknown quantity. They had not fought a major land war in Europe since 1918. Their army was small, largely inexperienced, barely mobilized when Pearl Harbor brought them into the conflict. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was bleeding, dying, fighting street by street, kilometer by kilometer against the most powerful military machine on Earth. Stalin had watched the Americans from afar, wealthy, distant, protected by two oceans. He did not believe they understood what real war meant. Publicly, Stalin praised his American allies. He thanked President Roosevelt for Lend-Lease. He spoke of the common struggle against fascism. He called for the opening of a second front in Western Europe. But privately, his assessment was colder. According to Nikita Khrushchev, who witnessed many of Stalin's wartime discussions, the Soviet leader viewed American soldiers as soft. Men who had never known hardship, who came from a comfortable society that produced cars and refrigerators but not hardened warriors. Stalin respected power. He did not yet see it in the American infantry. What Stalin did respect was American industry. The factories, the production lines, the sheer volume of material pouring across the Atlantic and into Soviet hands. Trucks, jeeps, aircraft, canned food, locomotives, telephone wire, aviation fuel. Lend-Lease was not charity. Stalin knew this. It was strategy, but it was also undeniable. By 1943, roughly one-third of Soviet trucks were American-made. Soviet pilots flew American P-39 Airacobras and A-20 Havocs. Soviet soldiers ate American Spam. Stalin acknowledged this in his own way. In a private toast during the Tehran Conference in 1943, he reportedly said that the war would have been lost without American production, though he rarely repeated such admissions in broader company. The Americans, he concluded, fought with machines. The Soviets fought with blood. Stalin had demanded a second front in Europe since 1942. It did not come until June 1944. By then, the Red Army had already broken the back of the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad, smashed them at Kursk, and driven them out of Soviet territory. When D-Day finally arrived, Stalin's reaction was measured. He congratulated the Allies. He recognized the scale of the Normandy landings, but in private conversations recorded by aides and diplomats, he remained skeptical. The Americans and British had landed in France, but the Germans still had over 200 divisions on the Eastern Front. Stalin saw the invasion as necessary, strategic, even admirable in its execution. But late. Too late to claim they had saved the Soviet Union. As American forces advanced across France and into Germany, Stalin received reports. The Americans moved cautiously. They relied on artillery. They used air power to flatten enemy positions before advancing. They avoided frontal assaults when possible. Their casualties were lower than Soviet ones, by orders of magnitude. To Stalin, this confirmed his suspicions. The Americans were not willing to pay the price that the Red Army had paid. They had the luxury of overwhelming material superiority, so they used it. They could afford to wait, to bomb, to maneuver. The Soviets could not. Stalin did not condemn this approach outright. It was rational. It made sense for a nation that valued the lives of its soldiers differently, that had not been invaded, that had not lost 20 million people. But it was not the Soviet way. If there was one aspect of the American military that genuinely impressed Stalin, it was logistics. The ability to supply massive armies across oceans, the coordination of air, sea, and land forces, the capacity to sustain offensives without collapsing supply lines. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, one of Stalin's top commanders, later remarked that without American trucks and jeeps, the Red Army would have struggled to move its artillery and supplies during the decisive offensives of 1944 and 1945. Stalin understood this. He saw the Americans as masters of organization and production. They turned their economy into a weapon. They delivered that weapon on time. This was a form of strength. Not heroism, not sacrifice, but strength nonetheless. Stalin never stopped viewing the United States as an ideological enemy. He believed that capitalism and communism were locked in a historical struggle, that the Americans would eventually turn on the Soviet Union, that they were allies only because of temporary circumstances. But he was also a realist. He needed their weapons. He needed their factories. He needed them to tie down German divisions in the West, and so he played the game. He praised Roosevelt. He negotiated at Yalta. He spoke of post-war cooperation, all while preparing for the next conflict. To understand Stalin's calculation, you must understand Russian history, not Soviet history, Russian history, the history of invasion. In 1812, Napoleon's Grand Army marched into Russia with over 600,000 men. They burned Moscow. They were eventually destroyed by winter and Russian resistance, but the scar remained. In 1914, German armies smashed through Russian lines in the First World War. Millions died. The Tsarist regime collapsed. Revolution followed. In 1918, foreign powers, including American troops, intervened in the Russian Civil War, attempting to strangle the Bolshevik Revolution in its cradle. In 1941, Hitler invaded with over 3 million men, the largest invasion force in human history. By 1945, the Soviet Union had lost approximately 27 million people, entire cities reduced to rubble, entire generations erased. Stalin looked at a map and saw something his Western allies did not. Russia had no natural borders, no English Channel, no Atlantic Ocean, just flat plains that armies could cross. Every invasion had come from the West. Every invasion had penetrated deep into Soviet territory because there was nothing to stop it. No mountains, no deserts, no impassable barriers, just space and blood. Stalin's paranoia was not irrational. It was historical. At Yalta, in February 1945, Stalin made his position clear. The Soviet Union would control Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Eastern Germany, not as colonies, at least not in the Western sense, but as buffer states, a defensive perimeter, a glacis against the next invasion, because Stalin believed there would be a next invasion. Perhaps not immediately, perhaps not in 5 years, but eventually. The Americans had atomic weapons now. Stalin knew this. His spies had told him. The balance of power was shifting. He needed depth, strategic depth, territory between Moscow and any future enemy. Roosevelt and Churchill protested, but weakly. The Red Army was already there. Soviet soldiers occupied the capitals Stalin claimed. Possession was reality, and the Western Allies had their own spheres of influence. The British in Greece, the Americans in Japan and the Philippines. Everyone understood the game. Stalin simply played it with fewer illusions. By May 1945, the Red Army was the largest land force in the world. 12 million men under arms, thousands of tanks, an unbroken supply line stretching from the Urals to Berlin. American forces in Europe would soon begin demobilizing. Churchill had already lost his election. Roosevelt was dead. Truman was inexperienced. Stalin saw an opportunity, not for conquest, but for consolidation. The Red Army would remain, occupy, enforce, install friendly governments, ensure that Poland, which had been the invasion corridor twice in 30 years, would never again be used as a staging ground against Soviet territory. Was this imperialism? By any definition, yes, but Stalin did not see it that way. He saw it as survival, as the price the Soviet Union had earned through blood, as the only guarantee that the next war would not reach Moscow. He told his advisors, "Everyone imposes his own system as far as his army can reach." It was not a boast, it was an observation. Stalin was a communist. He believed in Marx. He believed in the historical inevitability of socialism, but he believed in geography more. Ideology could inspire, it could mobilize, it could justify. But geography determined outcomes. The Soviet Union had been invaded because it was reachable, because German tanks could drive across Polish plains without stopping. No amount of ideological purity would prevent that from happening again. Only territory, only control, only a belt of states that answered to Moscow and would fight, or at least delay, the next invader. This was Stalin's logic, cold, unsentimental, rooted in the lived experience of watching his country nearly collapse in 1941. He did not care if the Americans liked it. He did not care if it violated principles of self-determination or democracy. Democracy had not stopped Hitler. Red Army divisions would. The Cold War did not begin after World War II. It began during it. At every conference, Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam, the fault lines were visible. Stalin pushing for territorial guarantees, Churchill resisting Soviet expansion, Roosevelt trying to mediate, but ultimately conceding Eastern Europe because the Red Army was already there. Espionage was already underway. Soviet agents had penetrated the Manhattan Project. Stalin knew about the atomic bomb before Truman tried to inform him at Potsdam. The Americans knew Stalin was building his own sphere. They simply could not stop it without another war. A war their public would not support. A war their military was not prepared to fight. And so, both sides prepared. Stalin accelerated Soviet atomic research. He fortified his borders. He purged potential dissidents in the occupied territories. He built the foundation of what would become the Warsaw Pact. The Americans watched, protested diplomatically, began their own calculations. By 1946, Churchill would deliver his Iron Curtain speech. By 1947, Truman would announce his doctrine of containment. But the reality was already set in motion. The alliance had served its purpose. Hitler was defeated. Now the Allies would become adversaries, not because anyone wanted it, but because their interests, their ideologies, their strategic requirements were fundamentally incompatible. Stalin had known this from the beginning. And so we return to the original question. What did Stalin think of the American army? By 1945, he had his answer. They were formidable. Not in the way the Red Army was formidable, not through endurance, not through the willingness to absorb unimaginable casualties, not through the brutal arithmetic of attrition, but through a different calculus entirely. The Americans fought with machines, with industrial capacity turned into military power, with logistics that could span oceans and supply entire army groups without faltering. They had demonstrated this capacity in North Africa, in Italy, in France, in the Pacific. They had destroyed Japan with atomic weapons, a display of technological dominance that Stalin could not ignore. The American army was not battle-hardened in the way Soviet soldiers were. Their casualties were lighter. Their experience with total war was shorter. But they had resources the Soviet Union could not match. An intact homeland. An economy producing half the world's goods. A navy and air force that controlled global supply lines. Stalin respected this. Feared it, even. Not because he believed American soldiers were superior individually, he did not, but because he understood that modern warfare was no longer decided by individual courage alone. It was decided by production, by supply, by the ability to project power across vast distances and sustain it indefinitely. The Americans had built a system for this. The Soviets had built a system for survival. Stalin saw the American military as a reflection of American society. Wealthy, wasteful, reluctant to sacrifice, but overwhelmingly powerful when fully mobilized. The Soviet military was a reflection of Soviet society. Brutal, resilient, built on sacrifice and state control, capable of absorbing losses that would shatter other nations. Neither system was inherently superior. They were suited to different contexts, different threats, different philosophies of power. The Americans believed wars could be won cleanly, with minimal casualties through technological and material advantage. Stalin believed wars were won through suffering, through endurance, through the willingness to pay any price. Both had been proven correct in different theaters under different circumstances. But Stalin also understood something darker. The next war, the inevitable confrontation between capitalism and communism, would not be fought like World War II. It would be fought with atomic weapons, with spies, with proxy conflicts in distant lands. It would be a war where traditional measures of military strength might matter less than ideology, intelligence, and the ability to manipulate global events. In that kind of war, the Americans had advantages. But so did Stalin. He was already demanding territory, Poland, the Baltic states, Eastern Europe, already installing communist governments loyal to Moscow, already calculating how many divisions he would need when the temporary alliance dissolved. His intelligence services were already stealing American atomic secrets. His diplomats were already positioning Soviet influence across the globe. Because Stalin knew something his Western allies seemed slow to grasp. something written in blood across Russian history. Wars never truly end, they just change shape. The Americans would go home and demobilize, believing they had won peace. Stalin would stay and prepare. By the war's end, Stalin had formed a complete picture of the American military. They were not weak. They were not the equal of the Red Army in sacrifice or endurance, but they were something else entirely. A machine, efficient, well-supplied, technologically superior. They fought with steel and air superiority. They minimized casualties through firepower. They won through production as much as through valor. Stalin did not romanticize this. He simply recognized it. When victory came in May 1945, American and Soviet soldiers met on the Elbe River. They shook hands. They celebrated. Stalin watched from Moscow. He understood something fundamental. The Americans fought wars to end them. The Soviets fought wars to survive them, and in that difference lay the future of the world.